Today we will continue our journey into the history of the Second World War, and as always, I would like to begin by inviting you to slow down for a moment. Imagine Europe in the years after the First World War. The soldiers who survived that catastrophe walked home along broken roads and past empty fields, carrying with them a silence that was heavier than any weapon they had held. Entire nations were exhausted. Entire generations felt betrayed. And around them lay the ruins of promises that peace would be lasting, that hope would return, and that humanity would finally learn from the suffering it had endured. Yet, in that silence, something darker began to grow, almost unnoticed. It is one of the great tragedies of history that a world convinced it had seen the worst was, without realizing it, preparing the foundations for an even greater disaster. The story of how this new darkness emerged begins, in many ways, with Italy. Italy had entered the First World War hoping to gain territory and prestige. The leaders in Rome were told that by siding with the Allies, they would be rewarded for their sacrifice. But when the war ended, and the Treaty of London from the year 1915 was not honored as Italy expected, the nation felt deeply deceived. The bitterness of that disappointment seeped into every corner of society. Inflation rose sharply. Thousands of veterans returned to find no work waiting for them. Waves of strikes erupted across the country. Entire cities witnessed street battles between left-wing workers and right-wing groups. Many historians later described this period as a small civil war unfolding inside Italy, a conflict fought not along battle lines but through riots, fires, and political hatred rising like smoke in the air. Into this turmoil stepped a man named Benito Mussolini. In his youth, Mussolini had been a fierce socialist. He wrote for socialist newspapers, delivered fiery speeches, and openly encouraged the use of violence to bring down the old order. He believed that the monarchies of Europe had outlived their time and that revolution was both necessary and just. Yet when the First World War arrived, Mussolini shocked his comrades by supporting the conflict. He claimed that the war might create the conditions needed to ignite a widespread socialist uprising. For this betrayal of socialist ideals, he was expelled from the party, and it was in that moment of rejection that Mussolini began searching for something new. He looked at a country filled with anger, poverty, and fear, and he saw not despair but opportunity. He began to reshape his ideas around the concept of extreme nationalism, preaching unity not through class struggle, but through devotion to the nation above all else. From these shifting beliefs emerged what he called fascism. It was a movement that worshipped strength, discipline, and the absolute authority of the state. Mussolini gathered around him groups of violent young men known as the Black Shirts. They marched through the streets, breaking up socialist meetings, intimidating opponents, and asserting power not through ideas but through force. Fascism rejected individual freedom. It rejected liberal democracy. It rejected any system that questioned obedience to a single leader. What mattered was unity, order, and the belief that Italy was destined to rise again to the glory it had once held in the days of the ancient Roman Empire. In the year 1922, Mussolini and his followers staged what became known as the March on Rome. Many people imagine it as a grand military parade sweeping into the capital, but the truth is far less dramatic. The march itself was poorly organized and not particularly strong. The Italian army could have stopped it with little effort, but the king, fearful that resisting Mussolini might plunge the country into full-scale civil war, chose instead to yield. Mussolini did not seize power through conquest. He was handed power through confusion, fear, and the desperate hope that his leadership might restore stability. In that fragile moment, a dictatorship was born not out of triumph, but out of weakness. The impact of Mussolini's rise spread far beyond Italy's borders. His movement became the first successful model of modern extremism in Europe. The message was clear to other ambitious men across the continent. Chaos is not something to fear. Chaos is an opportunity. In a world filled with anger and uncertainty, a leader who promises strength can rise quickly, even if the foundation beneath him is shaking. And in the years that followed, other leaders would watch Mussolini's path very carefully. They would learn from his tactics, borrow his ideas, and in some cases surpass his brutality. Italy, through its own turmoil, had unknowingly opened the door to a much wider storm. When we turn our eyes from Italy to Germany in the years after the First World War, we see a nation wounded in both body and spirit. The Treaty of Versailles had not simply rewritten borders, it had rewritten the German soul. Under the terms of that treaty, Germany lost large portions of its territory, entire regions that had once been central to its identity. Millions of German citizens suddenly found themselves living outside the borders of the homeland. The German army, once a symbol of national pride, was reduced to a fraction of its former size. The nation was forbidden from possessing an air force. Its navy was cut to pieces. Even more painful than the military restrictions was the crushing burden of reparations. Germany was ordered to pay an amount so large that it represented roughly 20% of its entire national income every year. To many Germans, it felt not like a peace settlement, but a punishment designed to keep them on their knees. The sense of humiliation ran deep. Men who had fought bravely in the trenches returned home only to hear that they had been defeated not by force of arms, but by their own leaders signing a treaty of surrender. The word humiliation does not fully capture the bitterness that flowed through the streets of German cities. This bitterness soon turned into despair during the hyperinflation crisis of the year 1923. It is difficult for us now to imagine the weight of that experience. The value of money collapsed so quickly that prices changed within hours. A loaf of bread that had once cost a few hundred marks suddenly cost millions, then billions. Families carried their life savings to the bakery in sacks or wheelbarrows, only to discover that by the time they arrived, their money was no longer enough. Children played with stacks of banknotes because the paper was worth more than the currency printed on it. Entire families saw everything they had worked for evaporate overnight. The Weimar Republic, which had been created to guide Germany into a new era of democracy, now appeared helpless, weak, and incapable of protecting its citizens from economic ruin. The faith that Germans had placed in their new republic began to crumble. Many asked themselves whether democracy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Into this landscape of humiliation and chaos stepped a man who had once been little more than an angry agitator shouting in beer halls. Adolf Hitler had fought in the First World War and carried with him a deep resentment toward the treaty that had ended it. He believed that Germany had been betrayed, that the country's humiliation was the result of weakness and indecision. Hitler's early attempts to seize power, including the failed beer hall putsch, ended with his arrest. Yet prison proved to be a turning point. In the quiet of his cell, he began to craft not only his political ideas, but also his public identity. He studied the power of symbols, the importance of staging, the rhythm of speech. He looked closely at the rise of Mussolini and learned how a small group of disciplined followers, supported by force and spectacle, could overwhelm a frightened society. When Hitler left prison, he did so with a far clearer understanding of how to build a movement. That movement gained enormous momentum during the Great Depression. When the global economy collapsed, Germany suffered perhaps more than any other major nation. Factories closed, banks failed. Families found themselves without income, without hope, and without faith that their government could protect them. It was during this time that Hitler presented himself not simply as a critic but as a savior. He promised to restore German pride, rebuild the economy, create jobs, and overturn the Treaty of Versailles. His speeches were carefully crafted, full of emotional appeal, and delivered with a force that many Germans found electrifying. Meanwhile, the democratic parties remained divided, arguing with each other while the country drifted toward chaos. This fragmentation allowed Hitler to gain power legally. By the time he was appointed chancellor, the stage had already been set for a transformation that would change the course of history. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to dismantle the constraints of the Treaty of Versailles. He rebuilt the German army. He created the Luftwaffe. He marched his forces into the Rhineland, a zone that had been demilitarized under the treaty. And each time he violated the agreement, the governments of Britain and France hesitated, hoping to avoid another war. Their silence emboldened him. Germany's rearmament, once unthinkable, was now a reality. And with it, The foundations of a new and terrible conflict were being laid across the continent. The humiliation that had once weakened Germany was now being transformed into a dangerous and aggressive force, one that would soon sweep across Europe and plunge the world into darkness once again. When we shift our attention from Europe to East Asia, we find a story shaped not only by ambition but by fear, a fear so deep that it defined an entire generation of Japanese leaders. To understand Japan's march toward militarism, we must begin in the 19th century, when the nation was forced to open its ports after centuries of isolation. Western powers imposed unequal treaties that stripped Japan of the right to control its own tariffs, its legal system, and much of its foreign trade. For the Japanese people, who carried a strong sense of cultural pride and identity, this loss of sovereignty struck at the very heart of the nation. They believed, with some justification, that unless Japan grew stronger, it would be swallowed by the same forces that had conquered much of Asia. This belief was not born out of arrogance alone, but out of a profound anxiety that Japan's survival depended on its ability to compete with empires far larger and wealthier than itself. That fear became even more intense when the nation confronted a harsh truth. Japan lacked the natural resources needed to sustain industrial growth. It had almost no domestic supply of oil. It struggled to produce iron and steel. Its coal reserves were limited and often of poor quality. For a country seeking to modernize rapidly, these shortages were not merely inconvenient, they were existential. Japanese leaders looked at the world around them and saw Western empires controlling territories filled with oil, minerals, and fertile land. They concluded that if Japan did not secure resources of its own, it would eventually collapse under the pressure of economic dependence. Expansion, in their eyes, was not simply a strategy, it was a necessity. Many citizens accepted this logic, believing that national survival required bold and decisive action. This environment of urgency created fertile ground for the rise of a military that increasingly acted on its own. While Japan had a constitutional government, the army and navy operated with significant independence. Military officers believed deeply in Japan's divine mission and viewed civilian politicians as weak, corrupt, and overly cautious. As the years passed, officers carried out unauthorized actions to push Japan toward a more aggressive foreign policy. Many of these actions were deliberate attempts to force the government's hand. For example, when certain military leaders wanted to expand influence in Manchuria, they staged incidents or mounted operations without waiting for approval. Instead of punishing these officers, the government often yielded, fearing the political consequences of confronting the military. This pattern encouraged even more boldness. The army learned that if it created a crisis, civilian leaders would fall in line. Step by step, Japan's elected government surrendered control, not through law, but through fear. This loss of oversight helped pave the way for Japan's conflicts in China. The Manchurian incident, often described by historians as a manufactured pretext, allowed Japanese forces to seize the region in the year 1931. Manchuria offered land, coal, and the promise of self-sufficiency. It was portrayed as a solution to Japan's economic and demographic pressures. Yet the path chosen by the military soon led to far darker events. As Japan pushed deeper into China, the war expanded beyond anyone's expectations. The capture of Nanking marked one of the most painful chapters in modern Asian history. Accounts from survivors describe acts of violence on a scale that shocked the world. The tragedy left wounds that still influence relations between Japan and China today. For many Japanese citizens, this period became a time of moral reckoning that continues to echo across generations. As Japan moved further down the path of militarism, it began to see itself aligned with nations that shared similar views about power, identity, and destiny. Germany under Hitler and Italy under Mussolini offered models of strong centralized leadership, national unity, and rapid military expansion. More importantly, these countries rejected the international order dominated by Western colonial powers. Japan's leaders felt a certain kinship with them, believing that old empires had no right to dictate the future of rising nations. Together, Japan, Germany, and Italy crafted a partnership built on racial theories, strategic ambition, and a shared willingness to use force to reshape the world. For Japan, this alliance represented both opportunity and affirmation. It signaled that the nation was not alone in its desire to challenge the balance of power. In the end, Japan's turn toward militarism was shaped by a combination of fear, necessity, and ambition. The unequal treaties created a wound that never truly healed. The lack of resources pushed the nation toward territorial expansion. The military's growing independence weakened civilian control. The war in China deepened the cycle of violence and uncertainty, and the alliance with Germany and Italy locked Japan into a global struggle that would soon explode into a conflict far greater than any leader could have predicted. What began as a quest for survival slowly transformed into a path that led to immense suffering, not only for Japan, but for much of Asia. It is a story that reminds us how easily nations can lose their way when fear overshadows wisdom and when survival becomes an obsession rather than a purpose. As we turn back to Europe and look toward the years leading to the Second World War, we arrive at one of the most tragic chapters in modern history, a chapter defined not by aggression alone, but by hesitation, fear, and the heavy shadow of a war that had ended only a generation earlier. The governments of Britain and France faced a continent still haunted by the memory of the trenches. Millions of families had lost fathers, sons, and brothers in a conflict that was supposed to end all wars. The mere thought of entering another great struggle was unbearable to ordinary citizens. People wanted peace, even fragile peace, far more than they wanted confrontation. Political leaders understood this mood and knew that any talk of standing up to a rising Germany risked igniting anger among a public desperate to avoid repeating the horrors of the past. These democratic nations also found themselves weakened by economic turmoil. The Great Depression had shaken even the most stable societies. Britain struggled with unemployment and declining industrial output. France faced political division and economic strain. Leaders in both countries doubted whether their nations had the financial strength or the political unity required to sustain another long conflict. There was also a strategic calculation, one that seems shocking today, but was deeply rooted in the fears of the time. Many politicians believed that the Soviet Union represented a greater long-term threat than Germany. They feared communism more than fascism. Some even thought that allowing Germany to grow stronger might create a barrier against Soviet expansion. Layered on top of these misjudgments was a fatal misunderstanding of Adolf Hitler himself. British and French officials convinced themselves that Hitler could be reasoned with, that he would be satisfied once Germany's grievances were addressed. They mistook determination for rationality and ambition for negotiation. This belief guided a series of fateful concessions. In the year 1938, Hitler moved to absorb Austria into the German state in what became known as the Anschluss. The annexation violated the Treaty of Versailles, yet Britain and France, unwilling to confront Germany directly, accepted it. Encouraged by their silence, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a German-speaking population. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that by granting Hitler this territory, he could preserve peace in Europe. The Munich Conference was held, and without Czechoslovakia present at the negotiating table, Britain and France agreed to hand over the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise that Hitler would seek no further expansion. Chamberlain returned home waving a piece of paper that declared peace in our time. Yet, within months, Hitler broke every word of that agreement. German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that he had no intention of stopping at diplomacy. While Britain and France struggled to understand the scale of the threat, Germany used the period known as the Phony War to prepare for a new style of conflict. Hitler's generals refined the doctrine of blitzkrieg, a method of warfare that emphasized speed, surprise, and the concentrated use of tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry. Meanwhile, France placed its faith in the Maginot Line, a massive series of fortifications built along the German border. French leaders believed the line would protect them from invasion, but they failed to extend it all the way to the English Channel, assuming that the wooded hills of the Ardennes region were too difficult for an army to penetrate. This assumption would soon prove fatal. In the spring of the year 1940, German forces launched a bold offensive. Rather than attacking the heavily defended Maginot Line, they swept through the Ardennes. What French commanders had dismissed as impassable terrain became the pathway for the most devastating assault of the war. German divisions moved with astonishing speed, cutting through French defenses and driving deep into the countryside. Blitzkrieg was not merely fast warfare, it was warfare designed to shatter the enemy's chain of command, to create panic and confusion before resistance could be organized. The armies of Britain and France found themselves outmaneuvered and outnumbered. Many of the best Allied troops were encircled. The retreat to Dunkirk followed a desperate evacuation across the English Channel that saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers but marked the collapse of Allied defenses in the West. Within just a few weeks, France, one of the great powers of Europe, fell to German occupation. Belgium and the Netherlands were overrun. The continent that had shaped the modern world seemed to crumble almost overnight. It was not only the power of Germany that caused this collapse, but the weight of fear, misjudgment, and the desire for peace at any cost. Appeasement, born from the trauma of the First World War, had allowed a new and more destructive conflict to rise unchecked. Europe had waited too long to confront the threat, and by the time it acted, the storm had already engulfed nearly everything in its path. As we reach this final part of our journey through the opening chapter of the Second World War, we arrive at a moment when the fate of an entire continent rested on the resolve of a single island nation. After the rapid collapse of France, Adolf Hitler believed that Britain would surely seek peace. From his perspective, Britain's position looked hopeless. Its army had narrowly escaped destruction at Dunkirk. Much of its heavy equipment had been abandoned on the beaches. The prospect of standing alone against a powerful and confident Germany seemed impossible. Hitler expected Britain to accept reality, to negotiate, and to allow Germany to reshape Europe without further resistance. Yet in this assumption, he revealed one of the deepest miscalculations of his life. He did not understand the determination of the British people. He did not understand their willingness to endure hardship for the sake of freedom. And he certainly did not understand the technological and strategic advantages that lay quietly along the English coastline. One of these advantages was the chain home radar network. This system, though still relatively new, allowed the Royal Air Force to detect incoming German aircraft long before they reached the British mainland. It provided precious minutes to scramble fighters, prepare defenses, and organize responses with remarkable efficiency. Alongside this technological edge were two exceptional aircraft, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. These fighters, designed with speed and agility in mind, were more than capable of matching the German planes that crossed the Channel. And unlike German pilots, British pilots who bailed out over their homeland could be rescued, trained again, and returned to fight another day. Germany, on the other hand, lost experienced crews permanently, even when their machines fell intact. This difference in recovery and replacement would quietly shape the outcome of the entire campaign. Despite these advantages, the opening phase of the battle was brutal. The German Luftwaffe first targeted shipping lanes and ports, attempting to choke Britain economically. Then the attacks shifted to Royal Air Force airfields and radar stations. For a time, the situation grew increasingly desperate. British pilots flew multiple missions in a single day, often exhausted, often outnumbered, yet still taking to the air because they understood what was at stake. Britain had no fallback position. If the Air Force collapsed, the path to invasion would open. The skies above southern England became a battlefield where each hour of survival mattered more than the last. Then came a turning point born not from strategy but from emotion. After a small British bombing raid reached Berlin, Hitler reacted with fury. Instead of continuing to target the airfields that were pushing the Royal Air Force to the edge of collapse, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks towards civilian cities, especially London. The intention was to break morale, to make the British people so fearful that they would pressure their government into surrender. But the result was the exact opposite. The change in targets gave the Royal Air Force the breathing room it desperately needed. Airfields were repaired, pilots gained rest, squadrons regained strength. For the first time, the momentum in the sky began to shift. During those long nights when German bombs fell over London, the world witnessed the remarkable spirit of the British people. Families gathered in underground shelters, reading by dim lanterns, sharing quiet stories, while explosions echoed above. Photographs from that time show children wrapped in blankets, Elderly men calmly sipping tea, women knitting as though normal life could still be held together through small acts of dignity. Fear was present, but so was defiance. And above all, there was a collective sense that surrender was unthinkable. Prime Minister Winston Churchill played a crucial role in sustaining that spirit. His speeches, delivered with the gravity of a man who understood both suffering and history, reminded the nation that freedom often survives only when ordinary people are willing to endure extraordinary hardship. The turning point became undeniable when the Royal Air Force repelled a massive German assault aimed at securing final control of the skies. German losses were heavy. Their numbers could not be easily replaced. The British, strengthened by radar, improved coordination, and the renewed resilience of their pilots, held their ground. By the end of the campaign, Hitler was forced to postpone the invasion of Britain indefinitely. For the first time, the German war machine had been halted. As we close this first part of the story of the Second World War, it is worth remembering that wars do not begin because of one man alone. They emerge from societies that have lost their balance, from fears that overwhelm wisdom, and from choices that seem small in the moment but grow enormous in their consequences. History is not a cold set of dates and treaties. It is a collection of human experiences, many of them painful, many of them filled with regret, yet all of them offering lessons to those willing to listen. The 20th century taught us that indifference, division, and fear can open the door to catastrophe. But it also taught us that courage, unity, and resilience can shape the course of the world. If we understand the past with honesty and humility, perhaps we will cherish the fragile peace we hold today. And with that hope in mind, I invite you to join me in the next part of this journey, where we will explore the stages that followed and the events that would transform this conflict into a truly global war.